General Sir Garnet Wolseley's Ashanti Ring were a group of incredible officers who dominated many of the battles fought by Queen Victoria's army in the late 19th century British Empire. And in my last talk I gave an outline of how this ring of officers were formed and shone a light on some of the lesser known characters. Today I'm going to focus on one of the more famous or infamous members, who deserves a story in his own right. A soldier's soldier, highly popular with his troops, awarded the Victoria Cross for bravery during the Zulu War. He fought at the battles of Kambula, Ulundi, Tel-El Kebir, Tamai and Teb. Touted as a possible commander-in-chief of the British Army, possibly even leapfrogging his mentor Wolseley to that top job. And in 7 days, his career came crashing down. Instead of these battles or his bravery, he's remembered for just 2 words: Black Week. 3 defeats of the British Army under his command in the Boer War. This is the story of General Sir Redvers Buller VC. Redvers Henry Buller was born in December 1839 in the southwest of England. His family roots in Cornwall, but by now they'd moved across the Tamar to Devon and lived on an estate near Crediton, just outside Exeter, the city which his father had represented in Parliament. Tall, big-boned, strong as an ox, Buller was certainly never accused of being a thinking soldier. Brave as a lion and popular with his troops, even after the disasters that he presided over in the Boer War, Buller was a gruff, blunt soldier's soldier. Educated at Eton, he purchased a commission in the 60th Rifles, the King's Royal Rifle Corps, in 1858. His was one of the regular British regiments assigned to Wolseley for his expedition to quell the Red River Rising near Winnipeg in Canada. Whilst this campaign did not entail any major battles with Louis Riel's rebels, it was a battle against nature. Wolseley covered 600 miles across the wilderness and through the waterways in just 96 days. The local rivermen he employed for that successful venture would be called upon again by Wolseley in a future campaign far away on the River Nile, and I'll come back to that story later. One of the biggest challenges on the expedition was negotiating countless rapids on the waterways. This would involve manhandling the boats and all the supplies along the bank until they reached a navigable water again. Redvers Buller was renowned for his strength, even carrying a barrel weighing 300 pounds, 136 kilos, on one occasion. Wolseley noted that Buller was, quote, full of resource and personally absolutely fearless. Those serving under him trusted him fully. He teamed up with Wolseley again when the Rifle Brigade were dispatched to West Africa during the Ashanti War. In fact, the ambitious Buller was so keen to both serve with Wolseley and see action that he left Staff College without completing the course. And this little episode tells us 2 things about Buller that many people tend to overlook. Firstly, despite what happened to his reputation during the early part of the Anglo-Boer War in 1899, he was seen as talented enough to warrant a place at Staff College. In other words, he was seen as an officer with potential. Second, under all that soldier's soldier facade, Buller was ambitious. With the Ashanti War, he saw the opportunity to add to his military experience and credentials. He also saw in Garnet Wolseley someone in whose slipstream he could travel towards the top of the British Army. And he came a lot closer than many people realise, as you're going to find out in a little while, so stay tuned. With his physical strength and undoubted courage, Major Buller became part of Wolseley's Ashanti Ring, serving as his intelligence officer. By the end of the decade, Buller was serving in South Africa, first in the 9th Cape Frontier or Xhosa War, and then more famously in the Zulu War in 1879. At the outset of the war, Buller was placed in command of the mounted infantry in column number 4. This column invaded Zululand to the north of Lord Chelmsford's ill-fated column that was defeated at Isandlwana. It was commanded by another member of the Ashanti Ring, who we're going to meet in a later episode, Sir Evelyn Wood. Just 2 months after the debacle at Isandlwana, Buller's mounted infantry came within a whisker of being wiped out themselves when they were nearly surrounded by a Zulu army on Khlabani Mountain. In the ensuing rush to get off the mountain, Buller rode back to rescue an unseated officer, fighting off Zulus in the process, and for his actions he was awarded the Victoria Cross. He managed to rescue most of his force and fall back on Evelyn Wood's main camp at Kambula, although having lost 200 of his 600 force, the battle was a lot closer to a disaster than any sort of victory. Maybe Buller's personal bravery, which was never in doubt, and his VC, deflected attention away from the fact that he nearly presided over a monumental blunder. When the Zulus then attacked Kambula the following day, Buller led his mounted infantry as if nothing had happened the day before, first riding out to tease the Zulus into attacking the entrenched British positions and then pursuing the fleeing Zulus at the end of the battle. The Zulu defeat at the Battle of Kambula is often regarded as the turning point in the war, as the British inflicted their first major defeat on the Zulu army. At the end of the war, Buller was again commanding the mounted infantry at the Battle of Ulundi, where he used the same tactics that he'd employed at Kambula, riding out to draw the Zulus into attacking the well-prepared British positions, and then once more pursuing the Zulus as they broke. Like the majority of the Ashanti Ring, Buller jumped at the chance to serve under Wolseley in the Egyptian campaign of 1882. The only problem was that Buller was on honeymoon at the time, having just married Lady Audrey Townsend. But never fear, Buller had only married Lady Audrey on the understanding that their marriage would never interfere with his military career. So the honeymoon was off, and he packed his bags for Egypt. You might be somewhat surprised to know that despite this romantic start, the Bullers were to remain married for 27 years until his death. They had one daughter, Georgiana, born in 1884. Anyway, enough of romance, or certainly for Buller, let's get back to Egypt. Wolseley appointed him as head of intelligence. Despite having served in a similar role back in the Ashanti campaign, it was an interesting appointment. You may have already deduced that Buller was more of a brawn rather than brains soldier. His idea of intelligence was to ride as close to the enemy lines as possible and observe what was going on. None of that need for informants and scouts and all that stuff that Herbert Kitchener was to excel at in Sudan. Hardly surprisingly, Buller managed to get into the thick of the action at the Battle of Tel-El Kebir. Nor was it surprising to find Buller seeking, and Wolseley agreeing, to join the Nile Expedition to rescue Charles Gordon in Khartoum. Initially he was appointed as Chief of Staff to General Graham in the latter's Suakin expedition on the Red Sea coast of Sudan. Whilst Wolseley was waiting for his expeditionary force to arrive from Britain, the Suakin expedition was effectively a PR ploy by the British government and army to prove they were doing something, anything, to try and help Gordon in Khartoum and support their Egyptian allies, whose empire Sudan was actually part of at that time. On this campaign he was joined by fellow Ashanti Ring officer Herbert Stewart, who was in command of the cavalry. I mentioned Stewart in my last talk. Whilst he was only 4 years younger than Buller, he had not served in the Ashanti War and was a newcomer to Wolseley's inner circle. The general rated Stewart highly, a lot more highly than he rated Buller, who he recorded was not by a long way Stewart's equal. For an ambitious officer like Buller, Stewart was a rival, and throughout the Sudan campaign he took to constantly pointing out Stewart's supposed flaws and failings to Wolseley. During the Suakin expedition, Buller was to command troops in action at the battles of El Teb and Tamai. With Wolseley's relief expedition gaining shape, Buller was then recalled to Egypt to now act as Chief of Staff for the Nile Expedition. He arrived at Wolseley's forward camp with 46 camels carrying his personal supply of luxury food and champagnes from Fortnum and Mason. Buller was a soldier who knew how to live. The Nile Expedition should have been Wolseley's dream high-water mark in his career, having successfully negotiated the Canadian wilderness, the West African jungles whilst taking on the powerful Ashanti, before defeating Urabi Pasha and his Egyptian army. Now was the chance to rescue his own, as well as the Victorian public's hero, Charles Gordon. Indeed, Wolseley hoped not just to rescue Gordon, but by defeating the Mahdi, establishing British control in the Sudan. As you're probably aware, the reality didn't match Wolseley's script. A slow advance up the Nile gave the Mahdi the time to storm Khartoum long before Wolseley's main army was anywhere near the Sudanese capital, and Gordon was killed in the ensuing battle. Too late was the cry that went up in the British press. But why were they too late? Some would point the finger at Wolseley for delaying whilst he recruited those Canadian boatmen, remember that I told you about earlier, from his Red River campaign? And then he shipped them all the way from Canada to Egypt. Well, there was no way that Wolseley was going to accept that, so he looked around for others to blame. He lamented that the steamers that he was using to move troops and materials up the Nile from Egypt ran out of coal. He later wrote that there was a 3-week delay while he obtained fresh supplies. And who was responsible for the supplies of coal? His Chief of Staff, Redvers Buller. Wolseley also laid the blame on the loss of Stuart after the Battle of Abu Klea and the failure of his subordinate to press on immediately through hostile territory with a small force to Khartoum. As I mentioned in my talk on the Nile Expedition, this was disingenuous. But what is interesting was that the Desert Column may very well have changed things if they'd got across the desert faster. If. It's a great word in history. If they'd had enough camels for all their supplies and men, they would not have to have moved in slow relays. If that had happened, they would have probably got to the Nile before the Mahdi's army, so possibly no Battle of Abu Klea or death of Herbert Stuart. But they didn't have enough camels. And who was responsible for sourcing camels? You've probably guessed it, the Chief of Staff, Redvers Buller, a man who certainly knew how to source camels for his champagne supplies. But in the end, everyone decided to blame the Prime Minister, William Gladstone, for taking too long to send an expeditionary force down the Nile. He was soon kicked out of office. What is interesting is that Buller was never offered another command in the field for over 10 years. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, despite being promoted to the rank of full general, he filled a series of desk jobs back in Great Britain and Ireland. Was it Wolseley seeing that Buller really was a good fighter, but not a planner and commander? Or was it because Redvers Buller VC was seen as a rival? Wolseley was desperate to become Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, a position held for far too long by Queen Victoria's cousin, the Duke of Cambridge. The two men loathed each other, which was not good for Sir Garnet when the Queen would sanction her cousin's replacement, especially as she had a high opinion of Zulu War veteran and West Country aristocrat, Redvers Buller. I said earlier that Buller was ambitious, and he certainly had his eyes on the top job, even if that meant leapfrogging his mentor to get it. As Cambridge finally contemplated retirement, the Liberal government saw Buller as the ideal replacement, in preference to Wolseley. Let's face it, he had helped topple their former leader William Gladstone's government. But just when the elderly royal stepped down, there was a change in government, and the Conservatives, whose expansionist imperial views were shared by Wolseley, came to power, and it was Wolseley that got the top job ahead of Buller. So based upon 10 years of desk jobs and that rivalry, it might come as a surprise that when the Boer War broke out in South Africa in 1899, Buller was appointed to take command of the British Army in South Africa. It seemed that Wolseley's faith in Buller had a lot more to do with his energy way back in Canada and West Africa and Zululand, rather than the current reality. It also had a lot to do with his great rival Lord Roberts, hero of the British Empire's wars in India, angling for that role in South Africa. Better an Ashanti Ring member than Roberts, one of his India men, even if it was Buller. Arriving in South Africa in 1899, Buller personally took control of the army in Natal, attempting to raise the siege of Ladysmith, whilst placing the two other armies, one protecting the Cape and the other attempting to relieve Kimberley, under subordinate commanders. In December, both of those commanders were defeated at the battles of Stormberg and Magersfontein respectively, and then later in the same week, Buller himself was defeated by the Boers at the Battle of Colenso. The three defeats in what the British press dubbed Black Week shook British public opinion to the core. Whilst Buller's strategy was not necessarily wrong, and he was under political rather than military pressure to split his army and send valuable troops towards Kimberley, his ability to command his subordinates, whether on the other side of South Africa or on the battlefields at Colenso and later Speenkop, were skills that he seemed to lack. As historian Byron Farewell said, while some of the British generals in the Boer War made stupid decisions, they themselves were not stupid. Merely, they were adequate, brave generals in an age where warfare required more intelligence and skills in its senior command. And no one exemplified this criticism more than Buller. It was a matter of when, rather than if, Buller would be replaced. And he was, by the leader of the rival India Ring, Lord Roberts. Somewhat graciously, Roberts left Buller in place in Natal, and his attempts to break through to Ladysmith met with further defeats at Valkrans and most significantly Speenkop, earning Buller the disparaging nickname playing on his forename, Reverse Buller. Finally, in February 1900, he did manage to break through to the besieged garrison at Ladysmith and then advanced into the Transvaal. Buller's reputation has been tarnished by Black Week and Speenkop. It's interesting to note that Buller's eventual relief of Ladysmith and his advance thereafter into Transvaal saw him innovate the way the British fought, copying Boer covering fire and rush tactics, and also advancing under rolling artillery barrages, concepts that the British Army had never used before, but which became standard tactics thereafter. Also interesting, it was Buller who won the last set-piece battle of the war at Bergendal, and it was Buller, rather than Roberts or his number 2, Kitchener, who predicted the Boers would turn to guerrilla warfare rather than simply surrender. And during that guerrilla campaign, Buller point-blank refused to follow the scorched earth policy being advocated by Roberts and Kitchener. The 2-year guerrilla war was an embarrassment to Kitchener and more importantly to Roberts, who believed that by capturing the Boers' capitals of Bloemfontein and Pretoria, he'd won the war. This new and unexpected and costly stage of the war needed some explaining from those generals. They needed a scapegoat, and they argued that if Buller had been a better general back in 1899, the British would have won the war earlier and, maybe, the Boers would never have resorted to a guerrilla campaign. Maybe they were correct in that accusation, but it also conveniently got them off the hook. Despite those debacles and his nickname, Redvers Buller, many ordinary soldiers still respected him right to the end of his life, and so did many people back in Britain. When he returned home, he was greeted as a hero, especially down in the West Country. General Redvers Buller VC died in 1908, and he's buried in Crediton in his native Devon. Undoubtedly brave, probably promoted beyond his abilities, Black Week became the event by which his career is remembered. A career in which he had almost reached the very top of the British Army, but which instead resulted in defeat, demotion, and a distinguished reputation irretrievably lost. Coming very soon, the stories of the last 2 greats from the Ashanti Ring, Sir William Butler and Zulu War hero Sir Evelyn Wood. And in the meantime, I have another story coming your way, when in 1859 the British and the USA nearly went to war, all over a pig. I kid you not. So make sure you subscribe, or better still, sign up to my newsletter so you don't miss out. Click on the link in the description. But before then, check out all my other videos on my channel. I've got over 100 now. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you very soon.